Could Jameis Winston reunite with Sean Payton as a potential backup quarterback behind Russell Wilson with the Denver Broncos? Who are some other backup quarterback options the team could take a look at in free agency? You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day you can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger. He is the site expert, predominantly orange.com. While we're still just about a couple weeks away from NFL free agency officially kicking off, one of the things we're looking at outside of the talks of Draymond Jones hitting the free agency market, the needs for the offensive line, the Denver Broncos are in the market for a backup quarterback potentially behind Russell Wilson this upcoming season, and there are a multitude of options we can look at.
There are, Cody. I think that this is maybe part of the conversation for the Broncos offseason that kind of gets a little bit overlooked. I think maybe people assume, hey, Brett Rippon's going to be back. Well, Rippon is a free agent. We know that coming up here, and we'll see. Will the Broncos tender him? We'll talk more about him as the show goes on, but certainly the backup quarterback position is one that's going to be in focus. And I think that I'm not going to sit here and say, a big-time investment is about to be made. But, man, I think it could be big time in terms of the name of the player. This year's free agent crop at the quarterback position is very good, all things considered, right? I mean, you've got a couple of starter options at the top, which of course the Broncos aren't in that market, but we'll see where our old nemesis Derek Carr lands here. Jimmy Garoppolo, where's he going to play? But as you kind of go down this list, even without Tom Brady, who retired, Cody, the free agent quarterback class in 2023 is about as good as you could possibly ask for a team like the Broncos looking for a backup. It's a bit oversaturated, so maybe you get somebody at a really good price. And I'm excited to talk about these options because I feel like it's not just, a bunch of old heads either. It's not just a bunch of guys that's like, this guy used to be really good in the NFL, or this guy, he's been a high quality backup for years. It's kind of got a group here of some high upside players that could end up being your starter in 2024 if things do go off the rails in 2023 with Russell Wilson.
And I think that's where a lot of fans are caught up in this whole backup quarterback conversation. Like, oh, we don't need anybody. Like, there's a multitude of names, right? For example, let's throw out the first one here. He was released by the Atlanta Falcons yesterday, and that's Marcus Mariota. Now, when that happened, I just simply put out a tweet and I said, I wonder if Denver takes a look at them. And then I was met with, all you media members do is drool over quarterbacks that get released by other teams. It's like, no, that's not the case. Like, before Denver had a quarterback, yeah, that was the case. I'd say we're probably guilty of that. But, in this situation, we know Denver is in the market for a backup, and that is an area they're going to look at in terms of upgrading behind Russell Wilson. And as you mentioned, not necessarily someone who's going to be in line to start elsewhere, but, there could be a chance, hey, if Russell Wilson were to ever miss any time, or if he played terribly, in a sense, Denver has a guy that maybe could step in and still be capable of helping them win games. That's the formula. You in the NFL today, you need a really good backup quarterback, and you could make a case you need a lot of quarterbacks considering what happened with the San Francisco 49ers. Hopefully the NFL looks at that one day, but let's take a look at Marcus Mariota. And then I was met with, well, he quit on his team. That's not necessarily true, folks, okay? He came in the offseason, reunited with Arthur Smith, who benched him in Tennessee for who? Ryan Tannehill. So there was no hard feelings there. He started 13 games, but all throughout that year, he was dealing with a knee issue that kept bugging him. It got worse as the season progressed, and then his play suffered because of it. You could also make the argument his play suffered because their personnel at the receiver position was kind of up and down. And then, during the bye week, he gets benched for Desmond Ridder, who they wanted to see for the final 4 games. During that time, he left to go get a knee procedure and went on injured reserve. So people are creating this narrative that he just quit on his team. That's simply not true. And I want to put that out there. That's not who Marcus Mariota is. If any of you have ever covered him, I've watched him, growing up all throughout, his time at the University of Oregon. That's not who he is as a person. So I wanted to pinpoint that. He started 13 games, I mentioned. He threw for 2,200 yards in 13 games, 15 passing touchdowns. He had 9 interceptions. He also ran for 438 and 4 rushing touchdowns. He has the athletic trait profile, I think, to do something inside Sean Payton's offense. But do you want to get a guy at the backup quarterback spot who can do some of the things that Russell Wilson can? I don't know if you want to build your offense like that.
It's an interesting question for sure. I do like the idea of Marcus Mariota. You can't help but wonder, is he going to want to try to hold out for a starting job somewhere? And I think that this is where, like, this whole discussion about these quarterbacks, there's not enough starting jobs for all of them out there. So it's like you could put that asterisk on any of these names. Like, oh no, he'll hold out for a starting job with some other team. Well, you could say that about many different players at this point. So it's really a lot about situation. It's a lot about the fact of, and we've talked about this, who wants to come and play for Sean Payton? Like, who wants to come and be part of this? Like, Sean Payton, he's made a number of quarterbacks a lot of money, namely Drew Brees, namely Teddy Bridgewater, namely Taysom Hill, namely another guy who's on our list, Jameis Winston. And Jameis Winston, Cody, he was on pace a couple of years ago when he signed with the New Orleans Saints, sat for a year, then finally got a chance to play in 2021. He was on pace for over 50 touchdowns, the highest touchdown percentage of his NFL career, one of the lowest interception percentages as well. Sean Payton was obviously working well with him. I think that's another option as you look to, I think they were 1 year apart or something like that. Or maybe they were the same draft, Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota.
Yeah,
actually.
same draft, back-to-back picks.
Back-to-back picks in 2015. So you look at that's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. 2015, these guys are still young enough to say, like, look, they could give us a few years of good, strong play if need be. And I like the idea of, I know they're very contrasting stylistically, Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota, but I think we've seen Sean Payton. I just mentioned Taysom Hill and Jameis Winston. It doesn't get more of a high variance than that. So we know that he can work with these different types of QBs and build an offense around them to be successful. So those are 2 options. Those 2 guys who are back-to-back picks in that 2015 draft, I really, really like those 2 options with Sean Payton.
Well, and I talked to our good friend Ross Jackson. I asked him, I said, hey, what's the deal? Like, when you look at Jameis Winston, he's not set to become a free agent. However, he is. There's a belief in the Saints building, according to Ross Jackson, that Jameis Winston will be released. Now, he said that could change. If the Saints strike out on Derek Carr, they could keep Jameis Winston on the roster. But, 14 touchdowns to 3 interceptions in that final year with Sean Payton before he tore his ACL. Well, he came back last season and he struggled. They benched him after just 3 games, which I don't necessarily think. I feel like that was too short of a leash for a guy who was coming off of an ACL injury and getting hit at the rate that he was, and they benched him for Andy Dalton. And in my opinion, I don't think that really paid dividends for the Saints. It is what it is. But I think we live in such a time where, like, well, look what he did in 2022. You have to put context to a lot of these situations. They're different for every player. The environment is different. And certainly the environment with Dennis Allen as the head coach was much different than it was with Sean Payton. So, from a standpoint of what makes sense, Jameis Winston as a backup in Denver could make the most sense in a situation like this. But Broncos Country, we're going to continue our conversation. There's some more backup quarterbacks that we're going to talk about, that we're going to highlight on today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, and the midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use, and then you can bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to three-pointers draining a game. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment worth FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. The Broncos are in the market for a backup quarterback here in 2023 under Sean Payton, and there are so many options that they can choose from or take a look at, and we'll ponder all that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format or whether you watch on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. We just talked about Marcus Mariota, Jameis Winston, two guys that were back-to-back first-round picks back in 2015. Let's talk about another guy as well who's kind of had an interesting journey through the NFL, different teams, and has been a starter, has a lot of experience there. And that's Jacoby Brissett, who spent 2022 with the Cleveland Browns. And you can make an argument, Sayre, he was probably the better quarterback that they had last season in Cleveland.
He was, Cody. I mean, Deshaun Watson obviously maybe understandably looked a bit rusty coming back from missing the whole 2021 season and all that stuff. Although he was, at practice on a day-to-day basis with Houston. That's a different topic entirely, but very interesting situation developed there, in my opinion. I think Jacoby Brissett, we got to mention him because a lot of times we have these conversations, like I have them on Twitter, or I'll write about them on Predominantly Orange, or maybe we'll mention something on the show, and people are like, what about Jacoby Brissett? I've got that question a lot. Here's where I'm at on Jacoby Brissett. He would be a great option, but I do think, and I know I mentioned this in segment one, that you could say this about anybody, but I really do think that he will be a starter somewhere in 2023, not in Denver. I don't think he's a really realistic option, although I think you do have to put him on the list because he's one of the better ones. He's got, his former OC from Cleveland went to Arizona. He could go be a starter there for a year while Kyler Murray recovers. Frank Reich, very well connected to him. Carolina probably going to need a bridge starter. Tampa Bay needs a starter. So you look at all these different other situations. I think Brissett would be highly coveted by these teams and probably price himself out of the Broncos range. But like you mentioned, he was very good last year for Cleveland in terms of just very good. Like what were our expectations really for Jacoby Brissett going into the season? I think he outplayed my expectations. Like Cleveland had a top 10, top 12 offense there for a while, and he was running the show with basically just Amari Cooper at the wide receiver position. So kind of an interesting situation for him there. Another guy, Cody, that I'm interested in your thoughts on, an option that I really like a lot. Sam Darnold. Remember the apple of John Elway's eye back in the 2018 NFL draft? Broncos they've actually played against him a couple times in his NFL career, and he's played well against them. Where do you come down on Sam Darnold, who's I don't even know if he's going to be 20, 25, 26 years old by the time free agency opens. He's available, and he has an interesting connection in Denver already.
Yeah, his former teammate, Davis Webb, now the quarterback coach, is in Denver. My question is, how much say does a guy like Davis Webb have in quarterback personnel, right? He's a young guy, and I thought it was very interesting to hear from Sean Payton earlier this week about that, about why they decided to hire him, and I think it's intriguing, but it's he's probably going to be a guy that's in a very important position with not as much power. To your point, Sam Darnold has always kind of kicked the Broncos' rear end in recent years. I think the one time they actually had the advantage, they got the one up on him, was more so along the lines of that Thursday night football game. Brett Rippon, remember he rattled off that 45-yard touchdown run against Denver. And I remember when that happened, I was like, oh man, here we go. This season's just a disaster. Thankfully, Brett Rippon and Jerry Jeudy got things going, and the Broncos defense adjusted a little bit and made some things happen. I don't know how I feel about Sam Darnold as a backup though, right? I feel like because he's a former first-round pick, if John Elway was still here, yeah, I could probably see Sam Darnold being like, hey, you're coming to Denver as the backup here to Russell Wilson. I'm not sure how much validity there is to this as for him in a situation. I just don't see it. And, maybe he could stay on in Carolina. Maybe Frank Reich's like, hey, I saw a little bit of what a guy like Sam Darnold can do. He's got some tools still. He's a former first-round pick. Maybe he stays there. I think I'd have to adjust to it a little bit. So for me, Sarah, I'm not so sold on Sam Darnold. I feel like I'd have to see some more in order to do that. But you and I usually generally agree on everything. I'm just not, I don't know. I just have a weird feeling about Sam Darnold. That's my thing. But there is another option who's a former Bronco that could maybe be in line, has some connections to Sean Payton. That's Teddy Bridgewater. I've seen his name thrown out by Broncos fans. For me personally, Sayre, I just feel like we know what we would get with Teddy Bridgewater, right? We've seen Teddy Bridgewater before. I think he's a capable backup, but he's also going to be a guy that's just going to dink and dunk. And I think we saw this in Miami this past season as well. I want to know how you feel, though, about a potential reunion with Teddy in Denver reuniting with Sean Payton.
I mean, it's not my favorite option just because I don't see him as if things go poorly in 2023, here's your option for the next year or so. I just don't see him in that way. I think he's too much of an injury risk. I don't love the idea. I like Teddy plenty. I think we had our shot with him. I think we've seen over the last few years what he's capable of doing. Wouldn't mind it as a 1 year option behind Russell Wilson. I don't think that would be a big deal, but I would kind of be just disappointed based on the fact that you got guys like Darnold, or maybe remember a lot of Broncos fans really wanted Baker Mayfield when he hit waivers and went to the Rams and then just absolutely crushed us on Christmas Day. Baker Mayfield is an option out there. He's a free agent that fits this kind of high upside that's my personal brand, right? I'm kind of thinking in terms of higher upside. Another guy that really intrigues me that may be in line for a starting job elsewhere, Taylor Heinicke. He broke into the NFL with the Vikings once upon a time when George Payton was there. Of course, I think that was back in 2015. He's kind of been following Scott Turner around the league, whether that's, Vikings, Panthers, Commanders, could be now the Raiders where Scott Turner is as well. But I think there's an option there as well to come in. Hey, Sean Payton's a convincing guy, and Taylor Heinicke, he's a big-time RAS guy. So we know that's maybe why George Payton liked him in the first place, however much involvement he had in bringing him to the Vikings. So there's another option there, a guy who's played some ball, a guy who's won some games, a guy who's proven he can be that spark as a backup quarterback if need be. So a lot of really good options out there. And remember, we're not talking about this person as the 2023 starter of the Denver Broncos. It's a backup option. And as far as backup options go, in my opinion, these are all high quality, candidates.
I think you need that, right? And when you look at the teams that need a quarterback, we've talked about it, Carolina, the Raiders potentially. I think so much is going to be contingent upon the NFL draft. You look at the New York Jets, Tampa Bay, as you mentioned. Seeing where maybe some of these bigger name guys like Derek Carr and Jimmy Garoppolo, these are going to be the two guys that really headline, I think, everything this offseason. Where they end up, I think, will really dictate the pace of where some of these other quarterbacks go, because I have not seen, Sayre, if you pull up Spot Track and you click on unrestricted free agents, you filter it to the quarterback position, there are 33 available quarterbacks in free agency this year. And that's not including guys who could be potentially cut that aren't even set to be free agents initially. Things can open up a little bit, and I think this is a great time for the Broncos and for any team in need of a really good backup. Strike while the iron is hot. Try to make your case. And Taylor Heinicke, like I said, he's an athletic guy. I remember a few years ago when the Commanders came to Denver to play the Broncos, I just remember he had a couple of plays where the Broncos just locked up in coverage, and then it was like cover zero or something like that. Pressure would get up, and he would just take it inside the A gap and run for a first down. Like, he can hurt you with his legs. He can use his legs to, mobility to throw on the run. And then he's also got the ability to stand in the pocket, which you have tools you can mold. He's been around. He's not some slouch. I think Taylor Heinicke, in my opinion, should have been the guy in Washington to begin with, but they wanted to go with the Carson Wentz experiment, who is also available. I know a lot of people in Broncos country are not on board with the potential of Carson Wentz as a backup quarterback, but you know what? Anything is possible at this point in time. I think we can all agree Denver is in the market for a backup quarterback. But that leads us to our next point here. What should the Broncos do at backup quarterback for the quarterback room behind Russell Wilson? You're going to get that and much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But before we dive into that, let me tell you about what we have going on here. The Locked On Podcast Network. If you're a Colorado sports fan, we have you covered every single day, all year long, with your coverage of your favorite sports teams, especially with spring training going on right now with the Colorado Rockies. We have the Locked On Rockies podcast with the Colorado Avalanche getting healthy at the right time. We have the Locked On Avs podcast, and with the Denver Nuggets making a strong push to create distance as the 1 seed in the Western Conference. We have the Locked On Nuggets podcast, your team every day. What will the Denver Broncos do at the backup quarterback position? How might this impact Brett Rippon, who is a restricted free agent? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we appreciate you so much for taking time to listen to us, to interact with us here on YouTube, to interact with us on Twitter, at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. Always get in the conversation, Broncos Country. We appreciate you so much. Let's continue on here with our conversation regarding backup quarterback in Denver this upcoming season. It's a new regime essentially under Sean Payton. The only carryover right now that you really have with that position is going to be Russell Wilson. Now, I think we should highlight Brett Rippon here for a moment. He's a restricted free agent. The Broncos have the opportunity to do a multitude of things. Now, as a restricted free agent, Brett Rippon can negotiate and sign essentially with another team, but it can go back to Denver and they can place a tender. It could be a first-round tender, it could be a second-round tender, or it could be an original round tender wherever he was selected, and they get an option if they do that, either between a certain salary or they could withdraw it entirely and he could actually go to a team that negotiates and wants to sign with him. I do know this. Brett Rippon has told me that he would love to stay in Denver. He wants to see it through here when things really take off and this team finds success. And he's a great guy. He's well regarded in the NFL. He's well regarded inside the Broncos locker room and with the Broncos front office. But now with Sean Payton coming in, you have to ask yourself a question. Does that impact a guy like Brett Rippon and his prospects of being a backup quarterback where he was last year to Russell Wilson?
Well, I think it's a very fascinating discussion because Brett Rippon came into the league in 2019, right? Obviously, a number of coaches have cycled through Denver since that time frame. And I think that if the Broncos do let him get to the open market, I think he'll have plenty of suitors, Cody. I really do. I think Rippon, like you mentioned, he's a good dude. He's good for the quarterback room. He's proven in his limited opportunities that he's gotten. We know we haven't seen him start back-to-back games yet, but in the starting chances he has gotten, I mean, he has helped keep the Broncos at least pretty competitive in those games. So I'm not opposed to bringing Brett Rippon back by any means. I think definitely we kind of get what he is. I know there's been some talk about him maybe entering the coaching realm sooner than later. So he's an intriguing guy from that vantage point, but I think there's enough coaches around the league now who know how valuable Rippon can be to your quarterback room, not just in terms of a backup quarterback, but what he brings to that position group, what he sees, the way he sees the game. I think that he is a valuable player that certainly should get consideration from Sean Payton. As much as we heard Sean Payton, he heard great things about guys like Christian Parker, Marcus Dixon. I can only imagine he's going to hear the same great things about a guy like Brett Rippon.
If Brett Rippon does leave, like let's say the Broncos don't offer a tender at all, I could see him ending up in Kansas City as the backup to Patrick Mahomes because they just lost Chad Henne to retirement. They've seen Brett Rippon a little bit, and I mean, honestly, he makes sense for a guy that Andy Reid would be like, hey, let's have a mold here for that. So, hey, keep an eye on that. But I'm a big Brett Rippon fan. Here's what I think that they should do, Sayre. I think they need to carry at least 3 quarterbacks in that room this upcoming season. And I want to reference what happened in San Francisco in the playoffs. The NFL has to find a way, in my opinion, to create a rule that allows quarterbacks to have an extra quarterback without it really impacting their roster status, because I think it's ridiculous that, you have a situation. We've seen Denver get in this a couple times. I think it was Kyle Orton when he was the starter and he was banged up. You had Chris Sims coming in and starting, but Kyle Orton was the emergency quarterback. They literally lost Chris Sims and had to play an injured quarterback in Kyle Orton. I remember that. It was years back. You should never be in a position where Brandon McManus is going to be your emergency quarterback. I'm sorry. That is awful. Like, you don't want that to happen. The NFL, in my opinion, has to have a safeguard there. It shouldn't count against the roster to have an additional quarterback elevated. In my opinion, they need to find a way to change that. But with that 3 quarterback room, here's what I'm saying. I think that this year, Denver should roll with Russell Wilson. I still think Brett Rippon should stay around. I do think you sign a quarterback in free agency on a 1-year deal, but then you focus really on next year's NFL draft in 2024. Maybe find a guy that you were like, okay, hey, this guy has the traits and he has the tools, with a guy and pairing him with Sean Payton, that you can draft, develop, and then maybe years down the road, he was going to be in line to start for you. I'm not opposed to that option. What say you? What would you do if you had to say over the Broncos quarterback room?
Well, I think for me, Cody, I would go with one of these high upside backup options. Namely, I would say guys like Sam Darnold, Jameis Winston, if he becomes available, Baker Mayfield, Taylor Heinicke's, those types of guys would be at the top of my list to bring in. And if I was the Broncos, I would invest a little bit more in that backup position, just because of how we saw how important it was this past year. When you need somebody to come into the game, when you need somebody to start for you, I think we saw specifically was my number one pick would be Sam Darnold. We saw him come out this past season in Carolina. Things were not good before he got into the lineup, and I think they won four out of 6 games after he came in and played, and one of them was against the Denver defense, which was playing very well last year. I like Sam Darnold. I like his upside. I like the age that he's at. I like the opportunity to get him with somebody like Sean Payton. And I know people may come after me in the comments and talk about what's his upside. He's already been in the league for the 5 years or whatever it is at this point. Sam Darnold is still a young player at that position, right? And he came out of USC with a lot of issues. And like you mentioned, came into a situation in New York that was a bit dysfunctional, to say the least. So I think that there's still something there. And we've seen Sean Payton work with guys like Jameis Winston after that 30 interception year. He came out with Sean Payton and had a great, start to that season in 2021 before the ACL injury. The same logic could apply to any of these guys, really. Baker Mayfield, of course, Winston himself, somebody like a Taylor Heinicke. I think you get them with this coaching staff and you have a high upside option that's going to give you somebody to turn to if it comes to that. And then I would draft somebody in the 2023 class, maybe starting in round 3. I know Sean Payton in New Orleans, they took quarterbacks, with kind of a high degree of variance, but never like super high that I can remember. They didn't take anybody. So I think starting in round 3 on to the end of the 2023 draft, you take somebody, you develop them. There's also Jarrett Guarantano, who's still on the roster, right? The Broncos gave him a 2-year deal. So we'll kind of see where they're at with him and his upside. But I like the idea of drafting somebody this year, giving you the option to, let's say, just worst case scenario, right? You have to move on from Russ in 2024. Now you've all of a sudden got Sam Darnold. You've got a guy you drafted in 2023 who, hey, he's learned the offense. He might be ready to compete. And then you could look to the 2024 NFL draft as well, or 2024 free agency or trades or what have you. Just keep your options open by investing in the position now. I don't think it hurts anything to draft somebody. I don't think it hurts anything to bring in a high upside guy like Darnold or Mayfield or whoever. That's where I want the Broncos to go, to really feel good about this position in terms of this guy could be something, if even a bridge for us in 2024.
Well, and I think the biggest thing too, Broncos Country, we are throwing out backup quarterback. We're not talking about guys you should bring in to start, right? But I think to Sayre's point, as you mentioned, high-end guys who aren't going to start in Denver, but if you need them to, you aren't pulling your hair out. You're not necessarily overly stressed about, maybe Russell Wilson not being in the lineup because hey, we have actually a pretty solid backup. You need that in the NFL today. It is so paramount to have a guy behind your starting quarterback who can come in and still lead you to wins. Look, who's probably got the best backup quarterback in the NFL right now? Just thinking, in the top of my head, Sayre, the name that comes to mind is Case Keenum as one of those guys. Last year, before the Matthew Stafford injury, okay, you can say, hey, Baker Mayfield behind Matthew Stafford, that's probably going to be the best backup quarterback in the league. We'll see how things play out there. Backups are a backup for a reason. They're not the starter, but they're capable enough to get you some wins in the event your starter misses time. Denver has to invest in that. And Broncos Country, we're eager for who you would like to see in the Broncos quarterback room as the backup to Russell Wilson this upcoming season. Make sure you drop your comments on YouTube down below. Interact with other members of Broncos Country. Always keep things respectful with one another. Or you can always tweet us on Twitter if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Lockdown Broncos. But Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show here. Lockdown Broncos on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch on YouTube. Sayre and I will be back tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show, talk about the latest around the NFL scouting combine. And the Broncos appear to be letting Draymond Jones test the free agency market. We talk about the risks of We talk about the risks of that and much more on tomorrow's brand new episode of the show.